Thank you for joining today's webinar on safety in the cloud. We'll be discussing general cybersecurity strategies as well as cloud-specific aspects. Before we get started, please note the Q&A feature that's built into the Zoom app. There'll be time allotted at the end of the session for questions. Let's begin. So who am I and who's Infotech? Well, my name is Marty Provost. I'm the Director of Hosting and Technical Services Department at Infotech, and I work in the Ashtore Products Division of Infotech, where we are the contractor for the Ashtore project software, which is owned by Ashto. The hosting services team within my department, we're responsible for taking the Ashtore project software, picking it up and putting it in AWS, where we manage it and host it for agencies. It's, I like to call, almost software as a service. So before we get started, let's see how you feel about your organization's current cybersecurity posture. So take a quick moment to answer the question that pops up on your screen. And the question is, how do you feel about your organization's cybersecurity practices right now? Are you locked up like Fort Knox? You think you're all right, could be better? Or what on earth is cybersecurity practice anyway? Hopefully there's not too many of you on that last one, but I just wanted to take a quick minute here to get a feel for where you're at now. Looking at the poll results, it looks like the vast majority of you are in the middle. You think you're doing okay, but you acknowledge that there could be improvement within your cybersecurity posture, and that's probably where most of us should be at. It's one of those things where you can never feel too secure. So that's great to see. All right. So looking at cybersecurity posture strategies in general first, before we dig into specific aspects of cloud security, I wanted to point out that to start with, there are three big categories of cybersecurity strategy that are very important. Every one of them is very important. You can't focus on just one. The technology is fun and interesting to focus in on. There's new software, new hardware, new tech, all kinds of fun things to work there. But if you focus completely on the technology and you ignore the processes or people involved, then you will fail. Looking at some recent cyber attacks, you can see exactly what I'm talking about here. The 2017 Equifax breach was predominantly due to their lack of patching on a schedule as part of their policy. So they had a policy to patch on a regular basis, but they weren't following that policy. That's a process failure. The 2018 Marriott breach basically was due to encryption not being in place. And that's in the technology sector category there. So they had the tech in place to encrypt data at rest and in transit, but it wasn't actually being implemented. The 2015 Anthem Wellpoint breach, that was all about the people. I'm sure, like you, we all get these phishing emails very, very frequently. All it takes is one person to click on a bad link and your organization's at risk. So the takeaway here is that you have to consider or impact all three categories here: technology, process, and people. Identify vulnerabilities and raise awareness. Now, you can't fix what's not broke, and you can't secure what you don't know is at risk. So first part of your cybersecurity strategy needs to evaluate your current environment, thinking about areas, not just in tech, like I said, also in your process and your people. Where are you vulnerable? If a certain thing is identified as a vulnerability, then of course you have to raise awareness about that vulnerability and start taking actions against it. Just documenting them alone and then putting that document in the folder isn't going to do you any good. So make sure that part of your strategy is to review your architecture, your environment, your policies, your people, identify where you're vulnerable, and raise awareness about those vulnerabilities so you can start taking action. Develop and document policies is a very important piece. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, offers us two very good tools or templates to work on this. There's the SP 800-53 security controls, really in-depth, really detailed, a great framework to follow, broken up into categories. I think it's 17 categories, and you can take them one at a time. That's an approach that we took, looking at each category, creating a policy based on those categories, and then taking that policy and creating an implementation plan. It's really important that not only do you say, okay, our policy is that we're going to do this, we're not going to do that, but then to have a follow-up implementation plan so that you make sure you're meeting that policy. Whether that means making sure you've got firewalls deployed, you've got audit logs being pushed to a central store, monitoring of those logs, all those types of things. Not only do you have the tech involved, but you've got the processes in place to make sure that you're meeting all those policies. Security awareness training, this is how you tackle the people factor. This percentage should be 100, should be 100% of leaders surveyed are treating security awareness as a top priority. Your people are oftentimes the weakest link, and the only way to strengthen that link is through training. Here at Infotech, we do regular phishing email tests. We don't call people out that click on the phishing emails, but it's a process that has helped to make everybody more aware of what a suspicious email looks like. How do you detect issues within a suspicious email? Not only the phishing aspect, but we also have a video training that goes over other areas of security awareness. And we used LinkedIn Learning, which turned out to be a really great platform. We incorporated some humor into it so people would actually watch it. And we were able to add in some questions that they had to answer as part of that training. So you knew it wasn't just running in the background as they were working and doing something else, not paying any attention. They actually had to pay attention to answer the question. So tackle the people issue through putting a high priority on security awareness training. Multi-factor authentication should be deployed anywhere you possibly can. It'll prevent 100% of automated bot hacks. If you're somebody in your organizations, if their username and password gets compromised and is out there, it won't matter if they also have to have their phone or other multi-factor authentication device with them for the username and password to work. Anywhere you can, multi-factor authentication should be implemented. It's really a no-brainer on that one. Audits should be performed regularly, and they shouldn't just be individuals within your organization auditing themselves, or perhaps another department auditing another department. It should include external entities auditing. And it's not a blame game type situation. It's more where the auditor's job is to help you identify areas where you need to improve. And a good audit is not just a penetration test. It needs to include a thorough review of your policies, your processes, and it has to include confirmation that you're actually following those processes and policies. And how do you prove that? Well, everything that should have an auditable artifact. So if your policy is that you review security scans on a quarterly basis, then there should be some sort of auditable artifact that you could hand to an auditor, not physically because this is the digital world, better not be paper. Hand them your audit trail that says, here's proof that every quarter we had our security scans, we logged the findings, and noted our actions, or if there was no action appropriate, then an explanation as to why there was no action appropriate. So that's a key that when you get deep into these types of audits that you learn is that everything that you do, you need to have some sort of auditable artifact. And it just makes life a lot easier to say, yes, auditor, I am doing this and here's proof. One thing that's often overlooked in a cybersecurity strategy are recovery plans. We focus a lot on preventing incidences, but we don't often think a lot about what do we do after an incident. Now, we don't want an incident, but if there is an incident, it's critical that you have a plan in place to recover from that. And a good recovery plan is one that is clearly documented, simple to follow, and most importantly, one that it would not be impacted by the security breach or virus, ransomware, whatever the case may be. If your backups are in a situation where if a ransomware attack started encrypting all of your drives, it could hit your backups and encrypt your backups. Well, that's not a good recovery plan. So I want to really stress the fact that a recovery plan has to be a big part of your strategy. How long is it going to take you to recover from a ransomware attack? How long is it going to take you to recover from this type of incident or that type of incident? Really important. So that was kind of an overview of cybersecurity practices in general. Now I'm going to shift over into the cloud, which is where I spend a lot of my time, and talk about what makes the cloud safe, or what can make the cloud safe when done right. The first thing is that inherently there's constant vigilance in cloud providers, hosting providers, security posture. Their entire business is dependent on them being secure and maintaining security. Imagine if one of the top 3 cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, if there was a security incident that was directly linked to a failure on their part, they'd be out of business. Nobody would use them anymore. If they can't trust the cloud provider, then they won't trust the cloud provider and they'll go somewhere else. So as a result, there's a much more constant focus on security from both your cloud providers and your hosting providers that you get by default when you work with those types of situations. Talking about cloud providers, in addition to them being constantly vigilant, they're also accountable and have the expertise to be accountable. I've got some stats here about AWS. That's the cloud provider that Infotech uses primarily. They're huge. They continue to be the top dog in cloud platforms. Azure's nipping at their heels. Google's also in the race. But they all are basically very, very large, very experienced cloud providers that you get to take advantage of their expertise when you work with them. They are accountable I'll use AWS's language of they are responsible. It's a shared security model. So AWS is responsible for security of the cloud, meaning the data centers, the network layer. They've got pretty savvy distributed denial of service attack prevention mechanisms in place. All that lower level stuff is their responsibility. And then your responsibility is security in the cloud. So when you use their services and deploy products or services, you're responsible for architecting your security in there. And it's a great model. They take care of the lower stuff, you take care of the higher stuff, and together you come away with a very secure solution. So the expertise that they provide and being able to shift that lower layer of accountability to them is a big benefit. Another benefit inherent to cloud systems is they are typically very limited exposure to ransomware or similar attacks. You don't usually have the same type of access to cloud services or cloud products as you do to on-prem services or products. And as a result, they're just safer by default. Like I said, the ransomware attacks, typically you wouldn't have the type of access to start encrypting files or folders or storage in your cloud solution as you would on your local file share. Some of the things that Infotech does specifically, and what I think that everyone should do to ensure security, these are sort of the big bullet points here. Encrypting everything at rest and in transit. Regular updates, that's a big one. A lot of the incidences that you'll see in the news are due to organizations not keeping current with patches. And oftentimes that's operating system patches, Windows updates, but it could also be application updates, it could be router updates, anything like that. There's no excuse to lag behind in the updates if you want to be secure. Make sure that you have a very small surface that can be attacked from the internet. So what does that mean? That means that the devices, the resources that can be directly accessed from the internet should have a very limited scope. Only certain protocols, only certain ports, no other applications on those devices, no data on those devices. Make sure that if you can get to it from the internet, it's locked down hard and tight and doesn't have anything extra on it than it should need. I mentioned the importance of audits and security scans. Go right along with that. Depending on your situation, that might mean monthly security scans, quarterly security scans. I probably wouldn't go any further than quarterly security scans. I think that if you waited at a longer interval than that, then you open yourself up for a little more risk. But don't just run the security scans and ignore the results too. You know, you've got to take those scan results, review them, address them, leave an auditable artifact for your auditors that are going to come in once a year or more. So I really think that's important. Make sure that your backup program meets your recovery time and recovery point objectives, and make sure that you have similarly redundancies in place to meet those. So, you know, your production database should have a hot standby. You know, your backup plan should include things that will be recovered from automatically, all the way up to things that take a lot of manual effort, and it's kind of a growing scale based on the severity of the failure. And that feeds into the last point here about just making sure that it's architected for resiliency and continuity of the systems. So now it's time for questions. The first question I see is, how are cloud systems safe from ransomware attacks? So I pretty much touched base on that in a previous slide. That basically it's because you don't have the same type of access to cloud systems as you do with on-premise systems. You know, you don't have direct file share access usually to a cloud-based system that you would on your on-prem system. And that's essentially what makes them more secure from ransomware attacks, is that you just simply don't have that same level of access. Next question I see is, what methods are you using to incorporate multi-factor authentication? So at Infotech, we use Microsoft's Azure AD. They have a built-in multi-factor authentication mechanism in place with that, and it's relatively easy and straightforward to align that with your Active Directory, your organization's Active Directory, and it works great. You can configure it to work with text messages. So, you know, you log in and it sends you a code through text message, and then you have to enter that code. Or more elegantly, you can use the Microsoft Authenticator app, where you have the app installed on your phone, and then it just gives you a prompt to approve the login. Both work great. There's some discussion out there that the Authenticator app is more secure than using the text function, but I would argue that the text function is exponentially more secure than not using any multi-factor authentication mechanism. So whichever works best for you, you're in a better place. Next question I see is, what are the costs for a cloud-based backup? Example, 5 terabytes of data needs to be protected, especially from ransomware attack. Received one 4.5 years ago and lost years of data that was unrecoverable. Really great question. So the cloud providers really got started with data storage. Amazon got started, AWS got started with their S3 service. And the answer is it's dirt cheap. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but I want to say it's less than 3 cents a gigabyte per month. It's certainly a lot more affordable than the alternative, and the truth is it is really dirt cheap. So that's a really great question. Your organization can easily take advantage of cloud storage to get your backups at another location. Doesn't have to be the primary location. It could be just a secondary location or a tertiary location. store them up in AWS S3 or Azure storage service. Excuse me. It won't cost you hardly anything, and when they're there, they are prevented from having the ransomware attack. So good question. Next question I see is a VPN not recommended when accessing the cloud storage? What VPN is good? That's a great question. So typically a VPN, a virtual private network, a secure encrypted tunnel from your agency to the cloud storage location is not necessary and not recommended. Really the only cases where you want to have a VPN tunnel to a cloud system is if you have to access that cloud system in a way that is not supported in a secure method over the internet. A good example that we still deal with is direct database access. So if you have a system in the cloud that your on-premise system needs to go right to the database, it's not going to go through the application layer. It can't use the HTTPS over the web. That's a scenario where you would want an IPsec encrypted tunnel between your agency and the hosted network to transfer data directly in a system that typically cannot be accessed securely over the internet. Good question. Next question I see here is what types of security audits do you have done regularly? So we actually have two external security audits done every year. One of them is our SOC 2 audit. So we recently got our SOC 2 Type 2 certification, and I was really happy to have that. And so that's one type of audit, and that audit includes everything, processes, procedures, tech, a little bit of pen testing, all of that. So that's one of them. And then the other is, we call it a security assessment. And it's very similar. It's very holistic. It's done by a third-party agency. They come in, they interview everyone, ask for auditable artifacts, just like the SOC 2 people do. Prove to us that you're doing these things that you say you're doing. They do some penetration testing. And if you're a development house, if you've got applications that you developed in-house, then the security assessors can also evaluate your code. It's kind of a separate task, so to speak, on the contract, where they can do some code reviews, and that can be really valuable. Next question I see: what companies do you recommend for a cloud-based backup? I have one employee in a business. I take care of that no matter how many times I've told them to ignore and just delete emails that are not recognized. They said they're going to click every attachment regardless. Seems like an unprofessional move, but they're not going to change. Infotech is very, very much invested with Amazon Web Services. We're an AWS partner. We've been working with them for many, many years now. So I would personally recommend AWS and their S3 simple storage service. What S3 stands for, that their S3 service is very well known and has a lot of different ways that you can utilize it. So I would definitely recommend those, or recommend them. And Microsoft Azure, right there along with them. We personally don't work as much with Microsoft Azure, but I have a lot of confidence in them as well. Next question I see, how do you minimize the attack surface area? So as I mentioned, the goal basically is to have anything that is sitting on the internet to have no data, no applications, restricted down to just what needs to come in by protocol or port, or if possible, source IP address. So what we use is Microsoft's Web Application Proxy Service. So it's what's sitting out there on the internet, and essentially it takes packets in and then takes them through to the inside and then translates them out. So all of your interactivity from the internet is just with that box, and then that box is interacting with the actual applications and data within the private network behind it. All right, we have time for one last question. So everything you recommended will ensure that any data in the cloud will be recoverable if our business located data is compromised. So yeah, I mean, that's your goal, right? That's definitely the goal. I'll use our example for Infotech's hosting services is that the data that we back up, we have it in 3 different locations and 3 different, well, 2 different methods. So one is the standard, if it's Oracle or SQL Server, the standard database platforms backup routines. So that data is available that way, but depending on the service you're using, it's tied specifically to that service. So those types of backups might only be able to be recovered if you're still in AWS or Azure or Google Apps. The other method that we use is we generate portable database backups. So like, for example, at Oracle, we create data pump backups. For SQL Server, we use the backup mechanisms, create .back files. We encrypt those and store those in a completely separate location. And we actually do that twice. We store it in 2 separate locations so that we have your data at the very worst case scenario, zombie apocalypse type situation. Amazon Web Services in its entirety is no longer functioning and ain't coming back. We've got your data stored somewhere else that we can get to, and as long as we can still install Oracle or SQL Server somewhere, we can get your data back in. And the worst case scenario is you'd have, at the very worst, 24 hours of data loss. It might be much less. It just kind of depends on the scenario. And so that's kind of where we're at. I see one final question I got to get to here. So in other words, ransomware data is protected. So in those situations, yes, because if you click on that ransomware and your laptop, your desktop computer starts chugging along and encrypting all the data that your laptop or desktop can get to, your laptop or desktop can't get to these backups. They can't get to that encrypted backup file that's stored in another region or stored in another provider. So yeah, that's the goal there, is that there's a separation. You can't get there from here type scenario. And so that's how you can prevent the ransomware from going too far. So with that, we're out of time for questions. If we didn't have time to get to your question, don't worry, we'll be sending a follow-up email next week with all the answers to the questions that were asked today. Thank you for attending today's webinar. I hope you enjoyed it and are leaving with valuable information on how to protect your organization. For those that answered the poll at the beginning with anything less than your organization is locked down like Fort Knox, I hope you find these strategies can be implemented to turn that around. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at any time. And be on the lookout for an email with a short survey and, more importantly, a general cybersecurity strategy checklist. See you in the clouds.